the national election on February 12th will coincide with a referendum for a reforms package. Citizens will be voting for their local MPs and whether or not they agree with the proposed package of reforms. This package of reforms is based on the July Charter. It will be presented in a four-part question with one answer, yes or no. This will be the first part of a three-part explainer. It will first explain what the July Charter is, and then there will be an explanation on how to understand or how to read the four-part question in the referendum. And thirdly, what happens if the referendum actually passes, meaning what happens if the referendum secures a majority. Today is part one. What is the July Charter? Let's begin with a little bit of context and background. On August 5th, the previous regime of Awami League fell, and 3 days later, on 8th August, the current interim government took oath and took office. Since then, there has been a strong call for reforms. The general contention was that the previous regime of Awami League had systematically dismantled and destroyed the very institutions that sustain this democratic People's Republic. So reforms were essential. And the chief of the interim government, chief advisor, Muhammad Yunus, has said several times that his priorities were first reforms followed by elections. Of course, later on he also added reforms, trials, and then elections. Either way, reforms remained one of the major priorities of the interim government. Towards that end, the chief advisor formed 6 commissions, focal commissions. There were other commissions as well, but the 6 were focal commissions in October of 2024. These included the electoral system, judiciary, public administration, police reforms, anti-corruption, and the constitution. The 6 commissions worked together and came up with 166 recommendations that were then sent to political parties for their feedback. 37 political parties replied with their feedback, and following that, there was another commission, the Consensus Commission, because there were divergent views among the political parties. And there was a clear need for further discussions to arrive at some kind of an agreement. For that, the chief advisor formed the Consensus Commission headed by Professor Ali Riaz as the deputy chief of the commission, and the commission itself was headed by the chief advisor himself. They had dozens of meetings through months, and finally, after several rounds of discussions, the Consensus Commission came up with an agreement among all parties. There were some ifs and buts, we'll get to that later, but this package of recommendation for reforms in different areas that I just mentioned were then put together. This package together is called the July Charter. Let me show you a copy. This is what it looks like today. This is a government publication that was sent to a number of news outlets. This is how it looks. I will show you the structure, how it goes. The July Charter begins with a little bit of background and context and history, although it's rather one-sided and criticizes Awami League, goes on to provide the basic background of the charter itself, and then it has what is pages after pages, if you see here, pages after pages of tables. On one side of the table, there is the recommendation, and on the other side of the table, there are names of, or rather numbers signifying parties that have agreed to the recommendation or those that have issued a note of dissent or disagreed. In a number of recommendations, there are notes of dissent, which is a clear protest or disagreement there are other instances where it mentions that certain parties did not agree. That is not so much as a note of dissent. A note of dissent is a firm no, so to speak. The numbers, of course, they signify parties, and the list of numbers, it's provided in the appendix, where one can go and find out which number corresponds to which party. These recommendations come in different parts. Begins with such things like state language, citizenship, constitution itself. It goes on to the fundamental principles of the state, which have been proposed that they be changed entirely. There's a section on the president, how the president will be elected, president's powers and authority, how the president may be impeached, the prime minister, appointment of the prime minister, also appointment of the caretaker government, and this of course also implies a return of the caretaker government system, which was abolished during the Awami League regime. It goes on and it includes other issues and points like the parliament, how it will be built. There is a proposal for a lower house and an upper house, and so on. It includes electoral reforms and the election commission itself, anti-corruption, police commission, which is an independent police commission is recommended for police reforms, and so on. These recommendations together, there are in total 84 recommendations. These then together make up the entire raft of measures, the reforms package that will be put on the referendum. But the referendum itself will be a different thing. That will come in a four-part question, as I mentioned earlier. Now, the July Charter itself, to give you an idea of what it is and how it goes, let me give you some example of the recommendations here. There have been a lot of discussion about a lot of recommendations for reforms in different areas. Many of them have been related to the Constitution itself, but also for, say, appointment of institutions or the commissions and constitutional bodies, the election commission and the chief of the caretaker government. Those have seen naturally the longest and the most strong debates and discussions through the last year during 2025. Initially, there was a recommendation for a National Constitutional Council. This would be a 9-member body that would appoint the head of the caretaker government, heads of the army, the armed forces, other constitutional bodies like, say, the ombudsman or the comptroller and accountant general, the election commission, and so on. This 9-member body would include the prime minister, leader of the opposition, other parliament members and deputy speakers of the opposition, speakers of both houses, chief justice, and so on. BNP was opposed to the National Constitutional Council having such an authority in appointing crucial people who will be heading certain agencies and institutions. Hence, there was a negotiation and a bargain. The National Constitutional Council's recommendation was finally abandoned, and the appointment process of different constitutional bodies were then separately put in as separate recommendations, which are now part of the July Charter. On the other hand, BNP then agreed to a term limit of the Prime Minister. So today in the July Charter, it says, because before it was proposed that the Prime Minister would not be able to serve as no individual would be able to serve as the Prime Minister for more than 2 terms, whether consecutively or not. This was then changed to a 10-year term limit. No individual will be allowed to perform or hold the post of the Prime Minister for more than 10 years, no matter how many terms. On the other hand, the appointment of the head of the caretaker government. Now, caretaker government is significant because that will be the administration that takes over takes over the government and oversees elections. Very crucial thing. The appointment process of the caretaker government is now contained in a separate recommendation and has several options. In fact, it outlines 4 options, after which it reverts or goes back to the options outlined in the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. Coming back to the state language, citizenship, and the Constitution itself. Under the previous regime, certain provisions had been included in the Constitution, making it virtually unamendable. Certain sections were made unamendable. So one of the first recommendations here in this July Charter is that those provisions be reversed and then the Constitution be made amendable. That's one of the recommendations. Another one is that previously the Constitution said that citizenship will be defined as Bangladeshi, whereas the nation should be called Bengalis. And now what it says is that citizens will be called Bangladeshis and doesn't mention anything else. Also, the state language will be Bengali, and other spoken languages in Bangladesh will also be recognized, which is a nice inclusion. Fundamental principles of the state used to be nationalism, socialism, secularism, and democracy. Those are now being replaced with equity, human dignity, social justice, religious freedom, and harmony. This proposal has also seen significant debate. Some parties have in fact issued strong notes of dissent, and they refused to in fact sign the July Charter because secularism was not included. They were of the opinion that the previous 4 should be included along with the new edition. That is no problem, but the previous 4 principles must still be retained in the Constitution. That's another proposal here. There's also the proposal that the certain schedules of the Constitution will be omitted if the July Charter goes through, the referendum goes through. The schedules to be omitted included the 7th March speech of Sheikh Mujib and the Declaration of Independence of 26th March. The Proclamation of Independence, however, stays in. And of course, the July Charter will be included in one of the schedules of the Constitution. Now, there hasn't been much talk or mention of the July Declaration to be included as another schedule of the Constitution, perhaps an oversight, because there was a discussion and a demand from the July uprising, the July movement, the July uprising leaders, students basically, who felt strongly about it and made it a point that the July Declaration must be a part of the Constitution as a schedule, of course. Coming to the position of the President. The President will be elected by secret ballot from both houses. Perhaps I should first explain the 2 houses. The parliament will be divided. The parliament will have two houses. Right now, there is a 300-member unicameral, single-chamber parliament where we have 300 MPs. The proposal is that there will be a 300-member lower house who will be elected on the prevailing first-past-the-post system. Then, on the basis of proportional representation, there will be an upper chamber called the Senate with 100 members in parliament, 100 senators. And these 100 senators will be picked on the basis of the proportion of votes the parties get in the general election. Now, what will be the threshold? What happens with fractions? Certain parties could get 1.5% of the total vote. Some parties could get 0.75%. Those things will have to be ironed out later. They have to be naturally figured out once the referendum passes. So those have not been discussed yet, and sometimes people wonder what happens to independent candidates, whether the Senate will at all have independent candidates or only those from different parties. Those have yet to be decided. But the general principle will be that there's a 100-member Senate and the 300-member parliament, the lower house. Now, the president will be elected on secret ballot, by secret ballot from both houses. The president will also have the power and authority to appoint based on the recommendations from different bodies or selection committees, to make appointments to positions like, say, the National Human Rights Commission, the Information Commission, chairman and members of the Bangladesh Press Council, the Law Commission, governor of the Bangladesh Bank, the Bangladesh Energy Regulatory Commission, and so on. It used to be that the president needed to be advised by the prime minister, in other words, dictated by the prime minister. But now that requirement or obligation is not there anymore. The president will be free to make an appointment based on the recommendation from the selection committees, which will have their process of choosing their candidates, and the selection committees themselves will be formed following certain rules according to certain recommendations. Interestingly here, according to the proposals in the July Charter, the Constitution can be amended. It will require a 2/3 majority in the lower house and a simple majority, a 51% majority in the upper house, which is still going to be somewhat challenging, although a party can get 2/3 majority in the lower house with something like, say, 40% or even 45% of the vote. They would still get only between 40 and 45 seats in the upper house, and securing a 51% vote in the upper house will require some support from the opposition. So the spirit perhaps is that the proposed amendments of the Constitution be so much in demand, so much right, that even the opposition joins the government, the ruling party, in supporting those amendments. However, to impeach the president, you would require 2/3 majority in the lower house as well as a 2/3 majority in the upper house. It seems that the July Charter places the office of the president above the Constitution, which is most likely an inadvertent mistake. But it's still here. So if the referendum passes, the referendum carries through, this will be one of the things that will come into effect. Well, not quite. It will still be subject to discussion, but nonetheless, that's one of the proposals here. Another important change in the powers of the president is that the president will not be allowed to grant clemency to criminals as the president sees fit. The president will have to have or secure permission or forgiveness from victims' families before there is any clemency from the office of the president. It wasn't like this before, and this is a change that many have mentioned as a significant one. Moving on, another interesting recommendation of the July Charter is an agreement to amend Article 70 of the Constitution, which barred MPs from voting against party lines. And if they did so, they would actually lose their seat. That was the rule. Now, however, the proposal is to allow MPs to vote against their party lines except two cases: finance bills and no confidence motions. The BNP, which is the largest political party right now, has recommended, it is of the position that this exception be expanded and two more provisions be included. One is that decisions during a war or national emergency, at that time MPs must vote along party lines, and secondly, MPs be barred from voting against party line when there is a bill to amend the Constitution. BNP, by the way, has also issued a note of dissent for the upper house having any role in voting for or against any constitutional amendment bills. According to the July Charter proposals, the upper house, the Senate, has some authority, has some check and balance, but not much. In terms of lawmaking, the upper house will not be floating bills by itself. The bills will have to come from the lower house. Once the lower house floats a bill, discusses it, passes it, it goes to the upper house, the Senate, for their discussion and their examination. Once there, the Senate can discuss on it and vote on it. If it loses the vote, the bill comes back to the lower house with recommendations of the Senate. The lower house then can, now the upper house cannot sit on the bill, it has to send it back within a certain timeline, probably a month or 2 months. But whatever happens, the lower house, once it gets back the bill, is not obligated to change the bill according to the recommendation of the Senate. It can if it wants to. If it doesn't, then the lower house can just simply take the bill and send it to the president for signing as it was. And so there is no obligation as such. There's just one, the upper house gets to say no once. That's pretty much the extent of its powers. And of course, it will get to vote on other matters like impeachment of the president or amendment of the Constitution. Among other recommendations, there was one for an independent police commission. This has been a perpetual recommendation from any exercise for reforms that had anything to do with the police. That hasn't yet gone through for different reasons, and it does not need a change in the Constitution either. It could have been put through. That's also part of the July Charter. Now, of the 84 recommendations in the July Charter, not every single recommendation will need a change in the Constitution. It is only for those that need changes to the Constitution that will be on the referendum. The other ones can be simply put in play through orders, ordinances, executive orders, and so on. The ones that are on the referendum include some 48 recommendations, and those are the ones that voters will be asked to choose from or agree with or disagree with. And the referendum question is a 4-part one, which we'll talk about in the next episode.